Boy, those guys look pretty serious, didn't they? The picture that was on the screen there as Andrea was reading those two scripture passages. First one, of course, was Charlton Heston as Moses. And the second was Diego Morgado. I think that's his name. He played Jesus in Son of God. That's a scene from the movie Son of God where Jesus makes, and man, that was a fancy whip he made really quick. Angry Jesus is what that picture is. So here's a slightly different way of looking at the Ten Commandments. It's a little different than that. And this is actually, this is a Jewish scholar's take on Moses receiving the Ten Commandments. That Jewish scholar, by the way, is Mel Brooks. So watch this.
Moses went to the mountain, and God spoke unto him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, I'm going to keep it, forget it. Oh Lord, why have you chosen me? What would you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord! Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me! Oh, hear me! All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 15, 10 to obey.
So some of you have probably seen that before. Some of you have probably seen it before because I've used it before. The thing about that is he's not wrong in so many ways. I mean, we're going to laugh at it because it's funny. It is. But by the way, in Jewish tradition, originally there were 3 tablets, not 2. There's still only 10 sayings. But that actually is the other thing. It doesn't say they're commandments. In fact, in Jewish tradition, it's called the Decalogue, which means the 10 sayings. And we only started using the word commandment in English thanks to the Geneva Bible, which was sort of not really a forerunner. It came out about 50 years before the King James Version of the Bible. So it was one of the first main English translations of the Bible. And in it, it refers to them as the 10 Commandments. And through the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, most Protestant churches, except the Anglicans, used the Geneva Bible. So you can see how that very quickly came into popular use. You can also see why we would say commandment. Here's 10 sayings from God. Here's 10 commandments, right? There's Charlton Heston, right? But he's got the 10 commandments, and it's like, because there's power in that. Here's 10 sayings that will help you all live together really well. There's no power in that. What there's power in is you shall obey. And by the way, almost all, in fact, I think 9 of the 10 say thou shalt not. But the point is, it's the moment you understand that they're commandments, they have power over you. Because you must fulfill them. So thank you very much, Geneva Bible, for that. Well, that's not fair. I wasn't really the Geneva Bible. They give us the word, but we've treated them that way since the beginning. We treated them as if they were law. And by the way, there's 613 others after these 10. Through Deuteronomy and Leviticus, there's 613 other laws that are actually called laws. These 10 are not actually called laws. And again, in Hebrew tradition, they're not actually called commandments either. But the thing is, we've treated them like that, and that means they're enforceable. Where in any of what you just heard does it say what happens to you if you don't follow the 10 Commandments? What's the punishment? Actually, I can answer that for you, because for 2,000 years, at least, Christian preachers, at least, have made a point of telling you that you're going to burn in the very fiery pit. But don't worry, I can save you, because I have the solution to help you follow these 10 Commandments. We've attached punishment to our inability to do them. We've even come up with really interesting ways of arguing what they might actually mean. So the commandment that we translate as thou shalt, not thou shalt. I'm still using the thou shalts, right? Because the King James Version makes it sound so much more powerful than you shouldn't kill people. Except it doesn't say that. It says we shouldn't murder people. No, wait, it actually says, there's a debate over that, as to whether or not it actually says kill or murder. Because if the commandment says thou shalt not murder, that makes war okay. That means taking a life in self-defense is okay. It means all sorts of things that it wouldn't mean if it said, don't kill. But we literally have no war if we follow that commandment. We'd also be all vegetarians. But the point is, we've come up with different ways of interpreting them so that we kind of can follow them. And we've also used them as a law to have power over people. You must do this. The Sabbath day is another one, by the way. What's the Sabbath day? Is it Saturday or Sunday? Well, it's Saturday, by the way. But the reason it's Saturday is because the first day of the week is Sunday. In Christian tradition. In the Hebrew tradition, it's Saturday because that's the Sabbath. But in Christian tradition, we have this big debate over whether or not Sunday is the Sabbath day. It's not. Saturday is the Sabbath. Sunday is the first day of the week. You remember the story? Mary goes to the tomb with the other women on the first day of the week. That's why in Christian tradition we adopted Sundays as being the day that we met. The original Christians, of course, being Jews, went to synagogue on Saturday and then they had their own thing on Sunday. We've come up with different ways of adapting to get around them, while at the same time we've wielded them as if they were powerful, as if they were commandments. They're sayings. And the context of those sayings is a nation, not a nation of people in the wilderness have just from centuries of living in slavery have found themselves having freedom and not knowing how to handle that freedom. And so God says, here's a way. Here's 10 ideas, 10 sayings that you could follow. All of those 613 laws after that, by the way, much like our laws today, have things attached to them of what happens to you if you don't. So, for example, if your neighbor works on the Sabbath, you can stone them. And don't forget, of course, my personal favorite, which is the one where if you wear clothing made of 2 different kinds of fabric, you can be stoned for that too. And not stoned in a good way, I mean they actually stone you. Right? So all of those laws have punishments. These ones don't have punishments attached to them. And there's a really good reason, I'll tell you why in a second, but there's a really good reason why they don't have punishments attached to them. But the context for receiving these in the first place was a people who were lost. And God says, here's a way you can find yourselves and find yourselves together, like being together in relationship. All of these things are about relationships for people that are lost. If I say that one more time, will you get that I'm implying that we're currently lost? I mean, look at the world right now. And not just between nations, but between people. We have in many ways lost the ability to create positive relationships. I'm generalizing, obviously. There are people and places where positive things are happening. Absolutely there are. But in the context of many, we could use some 10 sayings. We could use some paying attention to these things. And I know what you're thinking. We already have them. We have laws that say you can't kill people. Well, we have laws that say you can't murder people. And we have laws that say all sorts of other things. And why do we have those laws? So that we can live together better. We don't have laws so that you can control people and then punish them when they break them. We have laws so that we can live better together. That's the point. But again, kind of like the Ten Commandments, we tend to frame them in the context of you will not do this. Right? So, for example, you can't kill someone. What if we framed that as all life is important and you should nurture it and treasure it? Did it lose its power? Maybe it did, because we're so used to the other. So maybe it's a good time to revisit the Ten Commandments and look at them and go, maybe there's a more positive way of framing this. Jesus did that. I'll come to that in a second. But maybe it's time to look at them again as a people that are lost and reframe them in a way that's going to positively help us build more relationships. So, awesome, that's great. So, it's a great social contract. Except it isn't. It's a covenant. Even in the context of just being a social contract, it's a great thing. I mean, you can't argue with any of those. Okay, some people like to argue with the first ones, but we'll talk about that in a second. But you can't argue about honor your family or your parents. You can't argue with you shouldn't covet stuff that belongs to somebody else. You can't really argue with the fact that you need a day off once in a while. A day of rest. Those are all good things. So even on the basis of being just kind of a social contract where we can all agree to live together, it's great. Except it isn't that. It's a covenant with God, which makes it something bigger and better. That's why the first ones are about loving God. So in the context of these people, it's not just a contract with themselves, it's a contract with God. Now, again, as a world that is kind of lost, maybe we want to revisit that. I know what you're thinking. Try convincing some people that they should revisit the whole, and when you consider how many of us are meeting in churches today, or in synagogues yesterday, or in places of gathering as people of faith, different faith traditions, and the vast majority of people who don't do that, you try convincing them that the God thing is important. Except, it is, because it requires you to understand how you know God. So how do you know God? If you know God simply on the basis of, in Sunday school we were told that God is this, and God is definitely not the old guy sitting on the throne thing, right? God is this. Then that's not what I mean. If you are thinking about how you know God in terms of going to church regularly or reading about things in books and stuff, that's not what I mean. I mean, how do you know God? How do you personally experience God in your life? That's worth thinking about, and since we're in Lent, it's a really good thing worth thinking about. That's worth thinking about because if you know God as love, for example, reframe those first commandments in the context of God as love. If you know God as the supreme being, the higher power, the energy that connects us in the universe, the fabric of creation, any of those other many and different ways that we have of describing that power, however you know God, I'm going to say God, but I think all of those things are equally what God is about. If you know God like that, reframe those first commandments that way. Dang, I call them commandments. So used to it, right? So used to it. But think about that for a minute, because if you see it as just a social contract and these things are all good, we should behave better that way, that's fine. Except that if you see it in the context of, well, think of it this way. If God is love, if you love, your life is going to be different. If you love love, and you honor love, and you live love, and then you look at all of those other things that come after that number one thing in the sayings, they're all about that. You can't love love and not honor your parents or honor life. Or what's the opposite of coveting somebody else's stuff? Be thrilled for them. You can't. So reframing all of those things in the context of that very first one, however you know God, is what makes that covenant a covenant. I will be your God, live like this, God says. So, love God. Jesus reframed that later as, of course the first commandment is love God. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. And I believe the next phrase is, I'm going to say, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets, simply because I remember that from being a 12-year-old Anglican boy. But that's the point, is all of those other things hang on that. If you love God, all of these other things hang on that. If you love God, and you love yourself, and you love your neighbor, that's what that covenant's all about. How are you going to do that? Well, here's some ideas of how you can do that. There might have been 15, who knows? But there's certainly 10. Those other 613, by the way, they're not about this same kind of thing. They're about how you do things like worship and behave and stuff like that. These sort of top 10 things are the things that create and nurture relationship in the context of that covenant. What does that have to do with Jesus clearing money changers and animals and stuff out of the temple? It has everything to do with that. And it has everything, I think it has everything to do with why John, in the Gospel of John puts this story in a different place than the other three Gospels. In the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this story of Jesus, usually referred to as Jesus cleanses the temple. That creates all kind of images in my mind. But Jesus cleanses the temple occurs at the beginning of Holy Week. After Jesus comes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, the story of Monday is Jesus cleanses the temple. And then each day after that, of course, in Holy Week has a story leading up to Easter. But that's where the other gospel writers put it. John puts it right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The only things that have happened, in fact, the only thing that's really happened in Jesus' ministry before this story is the wedding in Cana. Right, where Jesus changes water into wine, a story which, by the way, only appears in the Gospel of John, after which John has Jesus go to Jerusalem and cleanse the temple. Which actually is an extremely accurate way of describing this, because we often, I think, we hear this story, and especially when we hear it as part of Holy Week, we hear Jesus goes into the temple and Jesus gets angry. And what makes Jesus angry? Well, you know, those money changers and the people selling the animals are just ripping the people off, and it's all bad news, and the people are being No, that isn't actually it. In fact, nowhere in the story does it say the money changers are ripping anybody off. Because they're not. They're actually changing your money, because that's what they have to do. Because, of course, Judea is occupied by Romans, so your day-to-day coinage is Roman coin. But in order to take your coinage into the temple and make it an offering, you have to change it into something that's acceptable to being in the temple. In other words, Hebrew coin. So the money changers were literally doing that. You bring them your Roman coin, they change it into something that's acceptable. Go in the temple, and off you go. The animals are all there because you've come to the temple, obviously, to make a sacrifice, because that's what you do. And you have different animals because if you can't afford a lamb, maybe you can afford a dove. Right? You weren't necessarily expected to bring the animal with you for sacrifice. You could buy it there. I know that sounds a little like Disneyland, Wait, that's actually terrible, doesn't it? Sacrifices at Disneyland. Anyway, but it sounds a little bit like, buy it when you get there kind of thing. But in fact, they weren't doing anything untoward, except they were between the people and God. That's what made Jesus angry. See, in Hebrew tradition, God lived in the temple. Literally lived in the temple. That's why the temple looks like that. This place of stone, which, as you think about it even more, I'm sure you'll start to think, why would God need to be kept in a place of stone so that there's another barrier between God and the people? And Jesus goes, all you people get out. You don't need all of this stuff to come to God. Your relationship with God doesn't depend on what money you bring. It doesn't depend on what stuff you sacrifice. It's about something else. It's about our relationship with God. This is the same Jesus, of course, who then says, destroy the temple and I will build it again in 3 days. Because he doesn't mean the walls that separate you from God. He means himself, because now we will come to God through Jesus. And Jesus is in all of us. So this is what Jesus is all about. This is why I didn't just stretch this for just a second, because in the hopes that this is something you might want to think about, is we traditionally see Jesus' most significant role as being that of atonement. Jesus sacrifices himself for our sins. Right? Because after Jesus is crucified, we're all instantly clean from sin, and we've been free from sin ever since. No, we have not. But we have traditionally believed that Jesus' role was to redeem us of that original sin, which, you're born with. Are we? For made in the image of God, are we? Maybe it's about something else. Maybe it's about Jesus bringing us back into relationship with God. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the point of all of these stories, is Jesus brings us back into relationship with God. That relationship that was created long ago. That's part of this covenant. Maybe Jesus teaching us to care for each other and love each other and nurture each other as human beings and to care for all of creation is part of the don't kill people, honor your parents. Maybe Jesus reminding us that you love your neighbor as yourself, which means you have to love yourself first. Why don't you take a day off to think about that? Just take a day of rest and think about that. And while you're at it, think about you will love God and have no other gods. Because remember, of course, that this is being told, the context of the story is at a time when there were a bazillion gods. And making an image of that God is what gave that God power. And what this God says is, no, there is only one God, and you do not need an image of that God. Because that God is in all of you, in all things. They're not laws to control your behavior. And we can't say that following them makes you a good person because you behave good. The whole point of them is to create that covenant in which we love all things and care for all things. Are we really any good at that? Well, that's a different story entirely. But the point is, and the point of Jesus reminding us constantly about it, is for us to try to live true to that. To live true to this covenant that we have with God, with love, with the fabric of creation, with however you know that God. That's what these things are all about. Would that have more power over you, or should I just point my finger at somebody randomly like Charlton Heston did? If we can understand that there is so much more power in that covenant, in that love, we will live into it in a way that creates relationship and builds us as people. That's the point of the 10 sayings.